Hi, everybody. I'm Angie Rasmussen. Just me again today for the Ebola update. Once again, both Jessica Malati Rivera and I work on Ebola virus. So Jessica, like me, has been trying to juggle communicating with everybody about this situation with actually doing work for her day job. So today, again, is just me, and we do have a lot of updates, unfortunately, on this ongoing situation. So to sort of recap for everybody who hasn't been paying attention to the grim tidings of our time, there is an outbreak of a rare Ebola virus species called Bundibugyo virus that has occurred in the Democratic Republic of Congo. This is the 17th filovirus outbreak or Ebola virus outbreak that has occurred in the Democratic Republic of Congo. So unfortunately, the DRC has quite a lot of experience with these large Ebola outbreaks. However, this is a new outbreak. There's only been one other outbreak of this particular Ebola virus in the DRC. And that was back in 2012. This particular Ebola virus has only ever actually emerged twice before this particular outbreak. First emerging in 2007 in Uganda, and then in 2012 in the DRC. And it's been circulating in its reservoir and not causing problems for people ever since then, up until now. So this morning or the afternoon in Geneva, Director General of the World Health Organization, Tedros, and please forgive me, Tedros, I can't pronounce your other names very well, so I just go with Tedros. But Director General Tedros gave a very sobering announcement about the current situation with the outbreak. So now we're up to more than 750 suspected cases, and I'm going to talk in a moment about some of the problems in terms of distinguishing suspected from confirmed cases. But there's more than 750 suspected cases, and now there's more than 175 suspected deaths from Bundibugyo virus. So this is it's a full-fledged Ebola outbreak. It's occurring in extremely challenging conditions. This is basically a war zone. There's a lot of armed, violent conflict. There are large refugee populations. There are populations of people who work in the mining industry and are very mobile because of that. There are people, because of these mines and their strategic value, they are targets of the conflict. So people associated with the mines will often be fleeing from conflict as well as going to work. The area itself is quite large and very difficult to access. There's not necessarily a lot of roads and infrastructure that makes travel from place to place very easy. Borders have been closed. The border to Rwanda has been closed. That doesn't mean that there hasn't been traffic across the borders, and that's something that's also very difficult. This is making the situation very difficult in terms of contact tracing, which is absolutely necessary to contain the outbreak. You can't contain an outbreak if you don't know how big it is, and you can't know how big it is if you don't know how it's been spreading in the population. Unfortunately, there have been cases reported in a number of different major cities, including Kampala, the capital of Uganda, which is a city of 2 million people, the large cities of Butembo and Goma. And yesterday we had a report from the Ministry of Health of a rebel-held province, South Kivu province, of 2 Ebola patients there, one of whom died. So we have this spreading all over the region, spreading outside the country. And good news, we had a preliminary positive from South Sudan in an area where there's a lot of refugees. And fortunately, it appears that that sample is now negative. So that patient was likely not infected with Ebola, which is great news to not have potentially an Ebola outbreak in a refugee camp. In addition to that, there was a case that was reported to be negative in Kinshasa, which is the capital of DRC, and it's a city of 18 million people. And that patient has apparently tested negative now twice. So that also is good news. And it really goes to show how important molecular diagnostics are for diagnosing this outbreak and getting it under control. Now, there are a lot of diseases, believe it or not, that actually can be confused with Ebola, because Ebola has been exaggerated in the popular press in terms of the type of disease that it causes. A lot of people think of the movie Outbreak. When they think of Ebola, they think of a lot of blood everywhere, people bleeding all over the place. And it's true that viral hemorrhagic fevers do cause uncontrolled bleeding, but the hemorrhage in Ebola, often the most common way that it manifests is what's called petechial hemorrhaging, which is essentially a rash. It's tiny little gaps in your capillaries, the tiny blood vessels that are closest to, the surface of your skin. And the tiny gaps that will form when the cells that line those blood vessels squeeze apart from each other. So liquid can flow in and out of the capillaries, and it screws up essentially the barrier function of your blood vessels. Blood will leak out of those capillaries, and it will form essentially a little red dot under your skin. And that's a petechial hemorrhage. So a characteristic rash is often seen on Ebola patients, non-human primates as well, that you infect with Ebola experimentally, because the hemorrhage is actually in the capillaries, under the skin. It's not, you're not vomiting tons of blood or weeping tears of blood or anything like that. Another thing that I think people don't appreciate is that there's not always hemorrhagic disease with Ebola virus. It can still kill you without doing anything to disrupt your coagulation system, because the disruption of the coagulation system is actually part of the fact that Ebola kills by inducing widespread uncontrolled systemic inflammation. And hemorrhage is just one mechanism by which it can cause death. Another way that it can cause death is by causing severe gastroenteritis. So vomiting, diarrhea that is so severe that, you're losing liters and liters of fluid every day. It is really, really difficult to stay hydrated, and patients can actually die of dehydration and the shock that comes from hypovolemic shock, which is the result of dehydration. So Ebola can look like a lot of different things. It can look like sepsis. It can look like gastrointestinal disease. It can look like malaria. And Bundabugia virus in the past, the outbreaks have been small, so it's very difficult to say this with accuracy, but the mortality rate has been a little bit lower than with, classical OG Ebola virus, or what we used to call Zaire Ebola virus. Bundabugia virus has been thought to be less lethal. We don't know that for sure. We've never seen it in a big population the way that it is now, so we'll find out. But it is possible that, we're not going to see as much hemorrhagic disease, and so this could be confused with other things. And as a result, that means molecular diagnostics are extremely important. So that means PCR to diagnose that this patient is in fact infected with Bundabugia Ebola virus. The reason we have to do that is if you have a patient that has malaria and you say, oh, they're an Ebola patient, I'm going to isolate them, and you put them with other Ebola patients, now you're potentially exposing them to Ebola and they don't have it. But if you say, oh, here's an Ebola patient, but I think they might have malaria, but we don't have a PCR machine to test it, and you send them off, with some malaria medication, they could potentially spread Ebola to a lot of other people. So it is really important to figure out what people are actually infected with when you're trying to control an active outbreak of something as dangerous as Bundabugia virus. So this has been a huge problem. That's why we only have, I think, 80 some confirmed cases now out of 750 suspected, because they haven't been able to get molecular diagnostics up and running. And this is entirely due to the fact that USAID has had its funding taken away. And a lot of the infrastructure and the expertise that was in place to carry out this type of molecular diagnostic testing, this sort of rapid setup of mobile labs in places, which again, the DRC has quite a lot of experience with, because this is their 17th Ebola outbreak. A lot of those resources have just been completely taken away. And so as a result, we're not able to carry out this testing. And that's a real problem when we're talking about moments, seconds being critical to containing this outbreak and preventing it from getting even larger. And what I'm really, really concerned about is that, the Imperial College report came out yesterday. That was a model that projected, how many people have been infected so far. And it suggested that it could be as many as 900 and potentially even into the thousands. And we're already getting into that territory just a day later in terms of the number of suspected cases. So this is a real crisis situation. We are not remotely at the point where we're on top of this. We're still very, very much behind. And a great deal of that is because of the U.S. withdrawal from their previous support and commitments to global health in this area. So that brings me to the next topic, which is something that people have been asking me nonstop for the last several days. And that is, what's our risk? Are we going to get Ebola? Is this going to become an Ebola pandemic? So the former CDC director, Robert Redfield, put out a very unhelpful quote in The Hill, where he said that he does think that, in fact, Bundibugyo Ebola virus is going to become a, quote, significant pandemic. And I actually have, forgive my, once again, bad production skills. I do have this headline of what Bob Redfield said. So I want to be very clear about who Robert Redfield is. He was very involved in PEPFAR, and he did a lot of really good work in that regard. He is a clinical virologist who has treated patients with HIV his entire career. Now, he's also a fundamentalist Catholic. He's one of these guys who thinks that we should still have Latin Mass because Vatican II was like a woke travesty of radicalism or something. So he's got some, weird religious ideas, and he's just the kind of Catholic who I guess just really wants it to be super old school, like it's, I don't know, Medici Pope's time or something. But anyways, he has had some problematic forays of his religious beliefs into his scientific practice over the years, including promoting conversion therapy for people with HIV as an alternative to HIV treatment. He also he was accused anyways of essentially making up data in a clinical trial for an HIV vaccine. And that's a topic for another time, because HIV vaccines are extremely complicated and they have a very fraught scientific and cultural history. But Robert Redfield is an HIV guy who has had some problematic ideas about people with HIV, to put it bluntly. He also was the CDC director during the COVID-19 pandemic under the Trump administration in 2020. And he was a pretty bad CDC director. He basically did nothing when Trump wanted to do crazy things. He really wouldn't take a stand. He really wouldn't stand up for science, to the point where Bill Foga, a previous CDC director, wrote him a letter that, God, I hope I never get a letter like that from one of my colleagues, basically calling him a pussy, because he was. And he since then has been promoting conspiracy theories. He claimed that scientists were sending him death threats and implied that it was me and my colleagues who were doing so because he is a lab leaker and he believes that the pandemic was created by gain-of-function research funded by Tony Fauci, which is a popular conspiracy theory in the Trump world that is meant to undermine public health further from what it has already suffered. Any hoodles, I don't believe Robert Redfield's assessment that Ebola is going to become a, quote, significant pandemic, or any kind of pandemic for that matter. We actually know quite a lot about how to control Ebola transmission. And I'm going to talk about that very briefly, because I think this is something that is getting a lot of attention in the absolute wrong way as a result of some of the very unhelpful discourse about hantavirus transmission that we were treated to before this Ebola outbreak emerged. Now, a lot of people like to say that because a virologist or an epidemiologist or some other expert assesses that a virus is not likely to cause a pandemic, yet still can be transmitted by the respiratory route, that they are somehow denying airborne transmission and that they are closing their minds to the fact that, oh my God, this is airborne and we're putting so many people at risk because we're too egotistical to acknowledge uncertainty or something. And this has been the cause of all the lost trust. This is quite simply not true. So I'm going to say something that I hope clears this up, at least for people who are listening to this and watching in good faith. We've known for decades that Ebola viruses, including Bundibugyo virus, can be transmitted by the aerosol route. You can inhale infectious Ebola virus, and you can get Ebola virus disease as a result from that. At the same time, Ebola virus cannot be transmitted from person to person efficiently by the respiratory route because people do not shed large amounts of Ebola virus into their airways when they are infected with it. And I'm about to explain why that is. It has to do with the types of cells that Ebola infects and the particular details of Ebola pathogenesis and its replication cycle. The bottom line, however, is that just because you can get any virus, whether it's hantavirus, Ebola virus, seasonal influenza virus, by the respiratory route does not mean that it is going to automatically become a respiratory pathogen that requires everybody in society to constantly be taking airborne control measures. That is simply not true with Ebola virus. And talking about these hypothetical risks of Ebola virus airborne transmission actually is seriously harmful because it takes away from the mechanisms that we know drive Ebola virus outbreaks and that kill people. So here is the deal. You can get Ebola virus by inhaling it. And the reason why is because your lungs are full of a type of cell called macrophages. Pulmonary macrophages are these cells that live in your lungs. They hang out there. They run around, or they don't run around. They sort of amoeba-like work their way around your tissue, and they just gobble things up. They just eat things. They're actually called phagocytes because phagos means to eat in Greek. I think Greek. Anyways, macrophages are phagocytic cells. They run around gobbling things up. And if they find something that gives them what's called a danger signal, meaning it's, this could be a pathogen, basically, this is something bad, they will actually move to the nearest lymph node or secondary lymphoid organ, and they will start activating your adaptive immune system to respond to this. So they don't actually stay in your lungs. They actually move, and pardon the dog barking in the background. I think somebody must be walking by outside and she's letting me know about the danger signal. Anyways, these macrophages will get infected by Ebola virus when they take it up in the normal course of their gobbling things up. It will give them a danger signal, and they will haul their ass over to the nearest lymph node. Once they're in the nearest lymph node, they will encounter other macrophages as well as specialized cells called dendritic cells that are also highly susceptible to Ebola virus infection. The infection will become amplified. All this Ebola virus will dump out into the bloodstream. That's called viremia. And then the hepatocytes will be infected because the blood filters through the liver. So the hepatocytes are where blood clotting factors are produced. And the overall infection, this high viremia in the lymph nodes, Ebola doesn't actually infect B and T cells, but it causes them essentially to commit suicide. It's a process called apoptosis. It's programmed cell death, and Ebola-infected macrophages and dendritic cells will induce cell death in the B and T cells. So now, guess what? You don't have an adaptive immune response to fight off this Ebola infection. Then your hepatocytes are getting infected. They're getting killed. The macrophages are dumping out these chemicals called cytokines, and they're pro-inflammatory cytokines. So it's basically putting your entire system into a very unnatural, everything is inflamed, off the charts state, which your body simply can't sustain. That causes nonspecific blood clotting. And so you get what's called disseminated intravascular coagulation, these tiny little microclots that form in your blood. And that, normally you would make more clotting factors so that you would still be able to carry out coagulation. But because your hepatocytes are what produce those and they're being killed by the Ebola virus infection, you can't make any more. And so you end up in what's called a catastrophic state of what's called coagulopathy, or basically fucked up blood clotting responses. And eventually you lose vascular barrier function, you go into hypovolemic shock, and you die. So that's how Ebola kills people. But note that even though it can happen via the respiratory tract, there's not really a pathway for this that puts virus back out from the respiratory tract. And that's what you need in order to have a pathogen like influenza, like COVID, that can transmit efficiently by the respiratory route. It's not just that you have to be susceptible to infection by that route. You actually also have to expel virus in a way that it will be transmitted to others by that route. And Ebola doesn't do that. And because Ebola infects all of these different kinds of cells that are highly specialized, and its pathogenesis really occurs in the immune system and the circulatory system, not in the airway, you're very, very unlikely to get something like a variant of Ebola that is suddenly going to be efficiently transmitted from person to person exclusively by the airborne route. Now, we do know a lot about how Ebola is actually transmitted, and it is very transmissible in certain circumstances. There are two circumstances that lead to Ebola transmission more than any others. One is healthcare settings, so caring for sick people. Ebola is a disease of compassion, some people say, because it often infects people who are providing care to sick people, and it also infects people who are preparing bodies for burial. Unfortunately, in the DRC yesterday, there was a aid facility, a clinic, attacked by people who were very, very upset about the fact that they were not able to retrieve their loved ones' bodies from this clinic after they had died of Ebola. Now, we know from the West African outbreak, which, by the way, was huge, more than 28,000 people were infected, more than 11,000 people died of Ebola virus disease. And I can't even tell you the scale of horror of that because of how terrible of a disease Ebola is. But unfortunately, this outbreak does have the potential to be that size or potentially even larger. But in the West African Ebola outbreak, a major, major driver of spread, particularly early on, before it was well understood that this is what was happening, were funerals, and people going to funerals, especially in regions close to the borders of the three countries, Sierra Leone, Liberia, and Guinea. People would go to funerals of an important community leader, for example. They would return to their nearby communities on the other side of the border, bring infections essentially back there, and then eventually they made their way into the cities. And I think I've talked about this before, but I'll never forget seeing pictures of bodies in the streets of Monrovia in Liberia during that epidemic, because there were so many dead people that the safe burial task forces were unable to get to all of them in time, and often bodies were laying there, and it just is something that it still really hits me to this day. Ebola outbreaks are truly inhumane in so many different ways, including the way that it makes it difficult for people to even bury the dead with dignity and without creating a risk for themselves. So by talking about, are we going to have an airborne Ebola pandemic ruin the World Cup in the US? I mean, sure, I understand why people are scared of that, because airborne Ebola would be terrible, and Ebola is a terrifying disease. But really, it misses the point of how Ebola is actually transmitted and how terrible these outbreaks really are. What I want to finish with is that people really need to understand that this should not be, oh, I'm scared because this is going to cause a problem for me and my family. Are my kids going to get Ebola? Am I going to get Ebola? Are we going to have Ebola in the US? We might have more Ebola cases imported, although I have to say the White House is doing everything in their power to prevent that from happening, including preventing Americans from accessing world-class biocontainment units and care facilities and care teams that know how to treat Ebola. But that said, we may have some Ebola cases in the US. I don't think, however, that Ebola will become ever even an epidemic in the US or in other wealthy countries, because we do know a lot about how it's transmitted, and we do know a lot about how to prevent that transmission. We know what type of PPE that healthcare workers need to use. We know about isolation and quarantine practices that work. And even though we don't have a vaccine for this particular Ebola virus, we don't have monoclonal antibodies, we don't have anything except supportive care. We actually do have a lot of experience providing supportive care. And that's also what I'd like to end with. My colleague, Craig Spencer, and I, and several of our other colleagues, Celine Gounder, Nahid Badilia, Megan Coffey, and Kritika Kupali all wrote an editorial in USA Today about how the US stripping resources from the rest of the world, and especially from Ebola prevention, have really, really created a situation that is much more dire than it has to be. And that is appalling, and that is something that every American should really know about and understand, because even though you might not be at risk of getting Ebola, I mean, you are still definitely potentially at risk of getting a lot of other things that the US has just demonstrated is unwilling and unable to effectively respond to. So, okay, maybe you don't care about Ebola at all. Maybe you don't care about what happens in another country. Maybe you don't care about the national security risks or the global health risks that thousands of people dying of a disease that is absolutely one of the most horrible diseases you could possibly die from, taking out entire families, that it doesn't have to, because the US just decided we're not going to do that anymore, and we're okay with all these people dying. If you don't care about any of that and you don't think that's going to affect you, okay. But what happens when it's H5N1, and what happens when it's in Ohio or Kansas or California? What happens when it happens in the US and we see that they're still responding as if it's in Central Africa? The US does not have the capacity to respond to emerging epidemic threats any longer. So we've seen now, we've got some sequences, there's some new sequences out of this virus, and we can see that it's not a variant. It's pretty much regular old Bundabugia virus, a little more modern, but there's nothing to indicate that it's any different. The only reason that this is causing a huge problem is because of our lack of capability to respond, our withdrawal from WHO, our choice to abdicate our responsibility for our commitments that we've made to global health, our choice to let people die horribly. And we're going to make that same choice if it's something that happens in the US. So I want people to understand that just because you're not going to get Bundabugia Ebola virus, and boy, am I tired of saying this already, just because you're not going to get Ebola does not mean that you're not going to get something else that our government is equally unprepared and unwilling to spend our taxpayer money to take care of us on. They are not going to save us. They are not capable of responding effectively. And I think they don't want to. They want the money, and they don't care if we die. And that's the message that everybody needs to take home from this. And as a human being, I strongly urge you to read Craig Spencer's New York Times piece from yesterday, which is, Craig is an Ebola survivor. He contracted Ebola while he was treating patients in Guinea. And he has an incredible perspective on this, both as somebody who has watched people die of this terrible disease and as somebody who almost died from it himself. but benefited from the investment that the US made in preparedness for Ebola. They saved his life, and I'm glad that they did, because we really need to hear his words, and we really need to see his perspective and understand that what happens to people in other countries that we could prevent could also happen to us. But more importantly for me, it comes down to something very simple. It's the right thing to do to prevent people from dying horribly wherever they're dying. That's a fundamental American value. As science chair for the Save America movement, I spend a lot of time thinking about what the right thing to do is. In this case, taking care of this Ebola outbreak, making good on our commitments to the world, trying to prevent the deaths of as many people as possible from a truly horrible disease is something that we should be doing, and it is the right thing to do. And with that, I'm going to sign off. I think that Jessica and I will be here today, later this afternoon, for taking shots, but there's been a lot of stuff going on because of this outbreak, so we may have to juggle that or shift it potentially to another day. But in any case, I'll see you also in about an hour and a half. I'm going to be on Steve Schmidt and Dean Blundell's show, Dead Air, for the Save America movement, talking about the Ebola virus outbreak. So you should join us at noon. Thanks, and have a great day, and stay healthy.